الإبداعية. مرحبا فيكم في دارت، وبدي أتكلم بس كلمتين بالإنجليزي بعدين بالعربي بعدين نتحول للإنجليزي. هذا برنامج بينه وبين مركز ثقافي بريطاني بلشنا فيه من عام في دعوة كبار أدباء بريطانيا، والبرنامج مركز زي ما انتم شايفين على كل الجنسيات اللي لها علاقة ببريطانيا، اللي لها علاقة بالثقافة البريطانية. فبندعوهم للأردن هون وبسووا لهم محاضرات في كافة أنحاء المملكة في الجامعات والمدارس والمراكز الثقافية. We are honored tonight to have the prominent British. Did I say British? Yes. British poet Jacob was Darat Funun, and this beautiful cooperation between us and the British Council started last year, and we have invited lots of prominent poets, writers from Britain, and they did their beautiful presentation in this beautiful house that has some relationship with Britain. It was the house of the British commander of the Jordanian army. Lawrence of Arabia lived in this room here in 1920 for 7 months. And I think it's the right place to have this beautiful program. And I invite you, all of us, to enjoy this beautiful evening. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Darat Funun and to the British Council for having me come to this beautiful room, space to talk to you a bit about what I'm about, and perhaps to talk about some aspects of the literature which is happening now in the UK. Of course, I can't tell you everything in one evening, but of course I'm sure that you will be asking questions, and I'll be very happy to answer them. Right? But what I want to start by saying is that based on many interviews and discussions I've been having here in this country, which for me is a very special place for many reasons. I'm not saying this because I'm talking to you here and you might be Jordanian, but I'm saying this because it's true for me. It's one of the few countries I feel I can return to and write. It's a very nice, very good space to be in. And I feel that there are lots of connections between Jordanian people and Jordanian culture and the concerns that we have, or you have, and the concerns I have as a writer, and certainly the society from which I come, which is the Caribbean, and the society in which I live, which is the UK, have in common with you. People ask me, when I talk to Jordanians, they're very interested in questions relating to identity, questions relating also to cultural values, which I think it is becoming more and more important, because it seems to me that the world isn't getting any bigger, it's getting smaller, and there are many very fragile cultures around the world which are actually being impacted on, to use a kind of awkward expression, by other cultural values. And there are important questions about whether or not we should, as what are our responsibilities as writers, in trying to defend or indeed to explain the changes that our societies are going through. But I believe very deeply, very strongly, that stories are important, that literature is important. And I will explain to you what I mean by this. Very often, when I speak now to people here, in explaining to them why I write stories, I say to them that if you don't write stories, you don't write novels about your culture, about your society, if you don't explain yourself to the world, that there's a great urgency here, a great need here for Jordanian people, and in a broader sense, the Arabic people of this world, and the Palestinians especially, to explain, to tell their story, to the world. So that stories are important. They're very important in explaining to the world who we are, why we are the way we are, and the great injustices which are happening to us, and perhaps the great things which are happening to us also. So I believe that stories are important. I come from a tradition of writers. They're Caribbean people. The Caribbean I can't show you here because, of course, well, I can explain to you. If you know anything about South America, we are very, very small islands, very close to South America, very near to Venezuela, very near to that part of the world. If I want to go to New York, I take a plane and I get there in about 3 hours. We're not very far from, and in fact, it is called, the whole area is called the Americas. I'm from there, these very small islands. And I come from a society where people are all new there. What do I mean by that? It means that just about 2 or 3 centuries ago, people came from Africa, or they were brought from Africa. They were brought from, they came from Europe, they came from even the Middle East, because we have many people in the Caribbean of Middle Eastern, especially Lebanese ancestry, living in the Caribbean. They came from China, and they all came together and began to mix. They began to live together in a society where, in fact, the people, especially the first large numbers which came, the Africans especially, I am from African ancestry. My ancestors have been in the Caribbean for the past 400 years. They were not allowed to speak the languages they came with. Okay, and they were not allowed to practice the religions that they came with. And there were many, many religions that they came with. Not only the African religions like Yoruba and Shango, but in fact, if you know anything about West Africa, you would know that the north of Nigeria, the Hausa people were Muslims. Okay, so many, many years ago, almost 4 centuries ago, we had people coming there and not being allowed to practice their religion, not being allowed to speak the language that they came with, not being allowed, in fact, to play the music that they came with. The drum was banned, and if one was caught playing the drum, one was executed. It's as simple as that. So that we had to build a new society, start from scratch, and build a completely new society, teach ourselves or create a completely new language. And that language is a language which I write in sometimes. It's called Creole. And I do a whole range of things with it. There's an enormous amount of pressure right now coming from the Caribbean, where I come from, even if I don't live there anymore, on me to write more in the language of my people, which is the language of my grandmother, my mother, and in fact the language we speak every day, which is not English. English is the language of education. And I write in English because I have been educated in English, I suppose, largely, but also because the tradition of writing in my country, especially all of the great writers coming from that part of the world who have been so important in influencing 21st century literature, English that wrote in English. Now that is changing. But we did have a literature, you see. But it was not a literature which was written. It was one which was spoken. People kept in their heads stories that went back many, 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 many years. And it's only very recently that us, the writers, the intellectuals, began to see the value in this literature which was never written down, which was always seen as inferior. We have a name for it. We call it orature, which is the literature of the spoken literature. And that literature is something which, again, many writers now are writing in. We are using very, very powerfully now in our poetry, because it's very different, the rhythms, and perhaps I will read a couple of poems for you so you can get a sense of what it's about. And I did not realize how important that literature was until I began to study very deeply, in a very serious way, the culture of my people. And I learned some very important things, that, for example, the way we told stories, there's a kind of story we tell, it's called the Nancy story. And a Nancy story has a special kind of way of being told. But let me just say that, first of all, it's about a very small spider, very often, that has to survive against lions, tigers, elephants, camels, this very small spider. And in order for this spider to survive it has to be very smart. It has to use its brain all the time. The story almost always ends with the spider winning, saving his life, and Nancy's name is, saving his life by outsmarting the very big enemy. We don't have lions in our country. So I asked myself, why is it if we don't have lions in my country, people are using the lion still in the stories? Is it because we remembered our history in Africa 400 years ago? Or is it that this lion, which doesn't exist in our society, still has a function, and what that function is? You have to understand that the people who came to the Caribbean, people like from my lineage, the majority are in fact of African origin. You have to understand also that the majority were slaves before. They were treated as animals. You know what slaves are, okay? And that in fact, they were living in a system which was designed to kill them, basically. And they survived it. How did they survive? They survived through these stories, because the stories taught the children from very young that you are small like a spider, you're a slave. Yeah? But in order to survive this, you have to be smart, you have to use your brain. So in fact, you are a Nancy. You are the spider. The lion, is in fact the person who has enslaved you. And that is why it has survived for so long. And so that what I'm saying to you is that from very early, I learned that our literature was a literature that had a purpose, it had a function. It was there to teach us the rules, the lessons of surviving in a situation of siege, of oppression. Okay? And I, without realizing it, I find myself writing like that very often. My first book, Funun, which came out maybe 15 years ago. This book did something quite extraordinary for me personally. I wrote it almost as a child would write, or a young person would write stories or write something and just forget about it. In fact, many of the stories in this book were collected by friends because I wrote them and left them. And what happened was that I found within a year of this book arriving, this book being published, I was getting phone calls from publishers in Germany, publishers in France, Latin America, in Africa, asking me for permission to translate this book. Because it was about Anansi. It was about children especially surviving in a situation which is not very different from the children, for example, who are living on the West Bank. Are you with me? In other words, these are stories about how do you as a child, how does a child live, how does a child survive a context of siege. I was born in a situation of siege, in the sense that I knew, as I've said so often, that from the time 6 o'clock arrived, I had to be at home because I would get shot. It's as simple as that. I learned from very early to read people. So if I see a man in a uniform that is green, with a gun, I know that I cannot stay around. I have to go home. Are you with me? I learned as a child. In other words, I, like so many of my generation, was born running. We did not have time to creep or to crawl. We had to learn to run. We had to learn to read our environment very early. I realized that many years later on, in fact, my forthcoming novel is about that. What it means to not have a childhood. What it means not to play as children do. In other words, what it means to lose your innocence from a very early age. Yeah? It's about the loss of innocence. So that's what a lot of my writing has been about. Okay. Let's pick this up about. Again, I'm not long ago, somebody from the BBC was interviewing me, and they were asking me whether or not I'm a committed writer. And committed is one of those words people are afraid of now. Many writers, when you say committed writer, say, no, I'm not. I'm just a writer, you know. You know, and writers get very scared now at being called or described as a committed writer. And I suppose I shocked the interviewer when he said, I take it, Mr. Ross, because I was supposed to be offended, you see, but I wasn't. He said, Mr. Ross, I take it that you are a committed writer. I said, of course I am. You know, I said, of course I am. And he said, pardon me, because he, you know, he really didn't want to believe that. And I said, I am committed. One, to my craft, and two, I'm not very different from a writer who is called Andrew Salkey, whom you may not know because he is one of the very first writers coming from the Caribbean, when he said, you know, part of what I am about as a writer is to convey something of the beauty and the dignity of my people and my society. And I am not scared of saying that. Okay? And I have found that, in fact, as a writer, writing about my own personal and private cultural space does not stop me from being universal, doesn't stop me from having appeal to people elsewhere. Okay? So that, I mean, that is really where I'm coming from as a writer. What are our concerns? What have been the concerns of the writers who came from the Caribbean and still are coming from, or in fact living in Britain and are no longer Caribbean in terms of nationality and so on? The concerns are still to do with identity. Who are we? We are a very mixed people. I told you a while ago that in the Caribbean is the most racially mixed society in the world. Any one of you in this room here can be Caribbean. Any one of you here. And I will not know this until you open your mouth and speak to me. When I hear your accent or your language, I know, oh, well, you're one of us in the sense of that geographical space. That's important. And also, I think that in that part of the world, people are much more prepared to mix racially than in most other parts of the world. So that, for example, you do see children with very, very dark skins and green eyes or blue eyes, European eyes, because, you know, or indeed you see children with skin, very African features, but having hair like, you know, somebody from India, because there are lots of racial mixes happening there. So that I cannot say that to be Caribbean means that to be black, or to be an African. We have to find another way of defining Caribbean. And in fact, one of the great poets coming from my part of the world, his name is Derek Walcott. You may have heard of Walcott. He describes himself as being divided to the veil, meaning that he is neither white nor black. He is divided. In other words, in his blood he is split. He belongs to two worlds almost. Yeah? And that is very important for us. So many of them have written about identity. They've also written again about exile, which is one of the great situations with many of us. You know, in my society again, or in the Caribbean, people tend to feel that it's almost a right that by the time you get to be 18 years old, or you've had an education, a very English one, if you're from the English-speaking Caribbean, or a very French one, if you're from France, the French are still telling Caribbean people in the French Caribbean that they are French men and women, and they believe it. There was a time when my father believed that he was an Englishman until he got to England, and they said, "You're not really." You're not really, you know. You have to kind of take some time, you know. And it's still an issue in many ways. But yes, the point I'm making is that for many of us, you know, we have to go through all of it, and we have to deal with it, and we write about it. Exile, we go abroad. Most of the writers from the Caribbean, including myself, have lived abroad, and we have been writing in the tradition of English literature. Not necessarily, only recently they've begun to write within the cultural and literary traditions of the societies from which they are born. And again, if you're interested, we can talk a bit more about that. That I find very interesting. Exile is important, not only from the point of view of the intellectuals, leaving all the bright ones, go abroad, qualify, they come from a society where you plant, where you live off agriculture, but they become nuclear physicists. They become hydrochemists. So if they return to the country from which they are born, they are useless. PhDs, wonderful. You're a great doctor in London or in Canada, but you certainly have no value. We don't need nuclear bombs in the Caribbean. We don't have the close to even build half of one. That again is a great, and we write about these issues. The young men, for many years, many decades in our societies again, what they do is they all leave. From the time they're 18 years old, they leave to go to work abroad. The Caribbean is regarded by many of the big countries in the world as a labor reserve. It's important to keep that in mind when you think about the Caribbean writing. And therefore, they would go to work on the big farms picking pineapples, oranges in the States. They would go in the 1940s, they were in England building back the railroads after the war. And what happens is that they leave the women, the older people and the children behind. It means, therefore, that our society is very fundamentally a society of women. Women are the ones who are the backbone of Caribbean society, despite the fact that it's only within the past decade or two you've had a woman leader of the country, and that was a very difficult one, because women tend to, interestingly enough, give value to their sons. So they would put their sons forward. They are the ones who become, in many ways, the leaders, but people who create them in the true sense of the word are the women. So that's my concern as a writer. As a writer, I have learned very early that I cannot write about Caribbean society, despite the fact that I get a lot of opposition sometimes from the male writers and the males in my society. They tell me that I've committed a kind of suicide, we call it gendercide, because I tend to focus so much on women in my writing and what's happening inside that female space that women are also writing about now, and so on. But at the end of the day, that is what a lot of my personal preoccupations have been about. And also, and I'll stop here to take the last questions. For me, I've been preoccupied with another very big issue, especially in my most recent novel, which I hope will be out very soon, maybe next year. It's about what it means to be a man in our society. This might sound very philosophical, very simple and naive for many of you. But there's only one other writer who I know who takes it very seriously, and he's a great writer. His name is Earl Lovelace. By this I mean, you see, growing up in Caribbean society, or in my society, I'll be more specific, to be a man, men usually define themselves, I've actually was saying this not long ago, in relation to women. So that a man is very often more of a man if he has more girlfriends, for example. A man is more of a man if, and in many ways women are the victim of all of that, isn't it? You know? And I am very interested in what it is that makes a Caribbean man feel that he's a man. What defines him? Okay? And I went back there last year, and I actually I put an earring in my head, and I mean, got like traumatized at the idea of me a man wearing an earring, but I wanted to kind of, and it wasn't making a statement about my attitude to women or anything like that, my preferences, but it was just me making a cultural statement. I still have the whole hair, and I think that if I wear an earring in Jordantown, some men might have difficulty with that. But it really is to do with how we see ourselves as males, and I've spent a lot of time looking at that and analyzing that, and in one sense, pulling it apart. One of the many things I write about, I write also about history, because again, our history is a very traumatic one. And there are two ways in which you can regard history as a writer. One is that you do what everybody else does, you ignore it, or you rewrite it, you reinvent it, or you face it full on, boom. In my society again, we tend not to want to look at our history because it was so painful, it was so traumatizing. And the example I give very often is the fact that 25 million Africans actually were taken from West Africa, the Congo Basin, the Niger-Congo Basin, that includes Nigeria, Senegal, Gambia, you name it. You know, 25 million were taken from there, but only 5 million arrived. 20 million died on the way. So that people, again, from my historical and cultural space, don't want to think of it. although history is living, it's always there, like Jordan. I look at this country and you tell me this is called Jordan, but that's one layer, right? Beneath that name Jordan, there's so much more. It's one land. When I go to the Jordan Valley and look across, I don't see any natural break. I see one land. But history is important, and I confront history very directly because nobody wants to do so, and we must. One of our great singers, Bob Marley, he said, in this great future, you can't forget the past. You can't, in this great future. In the future that you want to construct, you have to look at the past. And that is also part of my preoccupation as a writer. And in fact, the second book of short stories, which I have here, and I may, if you're interested, read a little bit for you. In this book, there is one story, which is the title story, A Way to Touch the Dust. And it's based on an incident that really happened in England, perhaps a couple of centuries ago, where a ship taking African slaves to bring them to the Caribbean, the captain decided that he didn't really want to make that long journey across the Atlantic, 3,000 miles. That's maybe 500 kilometers, I don't know. My math isn't that good. He decided the ship was called the Zone. It really happened. He was not going to travel across the Atlantic with these several hundred slaves in a ship and so on. So what did he do? He went beyond the horizon and just threw everybody overboard and returned to Liverpool, and claimed the insurance, much as you would do if you have a car that you want to get rid of. Some people do it. I'm not saying you do. you got a car and you really, it's not working very well, and you destroy the car, say that somebody stole it, and then you go claim the insurance. That's what he did. And what happened, and I read that as an entry in a history book written by a friend of mine called Joan Animado. And in reading that, it really stayed in my head. So I said to myself, okay, and other things happen when you go to Cuba. The Cubans have lots of stories about slavery. And one of them that the Cubans say very often is that under the Atlantic Ocean, there is a road of bones that joins Europe or Africa and the Caribbean, because so many people, perished on the way. And I just asked myself the question, what happens if one of those people on this ship was a girl who was thrown overboard, but she didn't drown. She decided she was going to walk, and she walked, and after 400 years, in other words, from the 18th century up until the 20th century, she's walking and arrives on the other side of the Atlantic, where we were. How would we receive her? It's an African girl. She speaks, she knows no other language. She hasn't gone through that process we have gone through, living in a society and building a new society. She's just come from Africa, but after crossing, we need to see 400 years. In other words, she is our history. How will we as a people face her? And that is what the story is about. And it's a love story, so that's to keep you interested. But it really does tackle these issues. And it's a story which has a very interesting effect on the people who read it, or who hear me read it, and perhaps I read something. And it's written in the language, again, of the Caribbean, but it's mixed with English. The rhythm is very Caribbean, the structure is very Caribbean. It's taken from the oral way we tell stories. Alright? I'll pause here. I can go on forever, I promise you. I kind of get into automatic and I just keep going. So I'll pause here and you can ask questions. I hope I didn't speak too quickly. Please ask me questions. Why did you come?
You said that you have, in the Caribbean, there was an oral literature. Did it originate from the African days, or?
I think it did. I think that the oral literature from the Caribbean, even though one wasn't allowed to speak, the original languages that people came with, Yoruba, Igbo, Mandingo, Romanti, Twi, Bantu, you name it, the people retained, they kept in their heads the story structures and the habits, and they told stories. And stories again became very useful, as I said a while ago, to educate children into surviving this cruel society.
I'd like to ask you, you said about the idea of being a man. So what does a man mean as a man in your point of view?
My point of view. What does a man mean? Well, it means to be a man, yes. But I'm still interrogating myself. Certainly, I think that I don't have the same attitude, the same view that most men from my society have about manhood. For example, I don't define myself in relation to women, well, I don't think I do. It's for women to tell me. And I'm not at all intimidated, if you like, by a woman's self, which is intelligent, which is persona, which is soul, if you like. In fact, people I engage with most significantly are indeed women. Because I grew up with my mother, one, and I'm not afraid of writing from that space, which is female space. In fact, people tell me I do it quite convincingly. If you read my work, if you don't know it's a man writing, my name, and it's me writing, it is a woman writing. And people have challenged me on this for many reasons. But it's because I have been so much my mother's child, My father died when I was young. And when I last checked, she was still my mother. I was very young, and I grew up in that space, which is a woman's space. And I'm always, in many ways, connected with my mother's feelings and all of that. And I really do feel that our society needs to modify its gaze, the way it regards women. I'll give you an example, and it's also a story in this book. If a woman has a choice, or a parent has a choice, she may have a very brilliant daughter, academically gifted, obviously gifted, now it's changing, and has a boy, a son, who is clearly not really cut out for that kind of thing. She has a choice, or he, the parent, has a choice. That parent would invest all of the resources into the boy still, because he's a boy. Right? Now, tell me, come on. And that is being modified now. And people feel very uncomfortable with this, but I really don't care. I honestly don't. I'm prepared to stand on this one. And in this year, there's a story about that. It's about a girl who's extremely gifted and a boy. Very bright also. She's won a scholarship, but she also obviously could win one, but she does not get to go to school. She has to stay home and take care of her children, the younger one, while her mother goes out to work. Okay? I used to live that. And I write about it because I feel I must. Because I do not feel that my society is perfect. I really don't. Okay? I don't feel that any society is perfect. And I feel that part of what we're about, if we don't adapt with that, it's as simple as that. Culture's dying on that. And I write like that. Yeah?
In the first story about cuckoos.
Oh, okay. Yes, so you've read the book, fantastic, yes.
No, The Laughing Tree.
Yes.
I read almost 3/4 of the story before I realized that the cuckoos was a girl.
Yes.
Was that intentional?
That was deliberate, yes. It's a story about property, which means so much. Again, not just to Grenadians, but to almost, property means a territory, means a lot, and means something perhaps different to people in this part of the world than it does to people in the Caribbean. But property or territory, owning your own, and keeping it means a lot to us. And therefore, and it's about that, And I hid, yes, the gender of the child. So it was a game to see, in fact, how people would read it to begin with, And most people, when they read it, assume it's a boy. And I don't know why. Why would you assume it's a boy? It could be anybody. So are we finished? There are no more questions? Do you want to go home?
Do you want to read it?
Do I want to read? Shall I read?
Please. Yes.
Okay, I took a couple of I do a couple of short pieces, a couple of poems. I don't normally read poems because I stopped reading poetry many years ago, and they're not really poems. I call them thought pieces, pieces of thought, and I do them for a whole range of reasons. but I was a poet before. I wrote poetry before I became a writer of prose fiction, of novels and short stories. I was, as most people from, again, my part of the world. I don't know of one Caribbean writer I don't know of one Caribbean writer who hasn't been a poet. So I try to be like them, you see. I try to be like them. And I'll just run through a couple. I'll do a couple of loved ones because I've heard, I don't know if it's true that Arabic people like love poetry. Is that true? Well, I do too. Right? Okay, and I'll just run through one. It's called For Two. That's proof also that I'm not always very serious in the sense of writing poetry and stuff. Okay. It's called For Two, and you may have heard it before. In rain we met and slept on the wetness of leaves aged and decayed as my faith and love. I could have told you so many things. Instead, I chose to trace with cold fingers the contours of your face and watch my love decline in the darkness of your eyes. I love you, said my lips, probing these words. Our nakedness would give meaning to these brittle words. And then you stirred, your hair so soft, so wet, like mud. Love, my friend, you said to me, is only a memory of pain felt deep in flesh and blood. And then you slept while I wept on the wet earth till I could not tell who cried, the sky or I. Sometimes I go for images, and I read a short piece which is called Church Street. It's a poem that I did when I was, or it's a piece that I did when I was living in the capital of my country, St. George's. And every morning I would see women walking up the street going to church, because there's a very strong Catholic tradition there. And the Catholic Church has not been kind to us, had been part of the apparatus that was used to keep my people, in my view, enslaved. It's not one which everybody agrees with there, but it is true. And I used to see people walking up, and in this early morning, very blue, because mornings are blue in the Caribbean, very, very blue. Almost like they're walking through water, to imagine the sea. And I wrote this one. And also there's the church bell which goes, we say the bells of the church goes, long, long, gone, long, the way the bell rings. Long, long, gone, if you heard the church bell. So keep that in mind. In the morning dark, my people walk to the time of clocks, whose hands have spanned so many years. And the church bell tolls, fading, ever fading beneath its shell of stones, hard as the heart of blue-eyed men, long gone, gone long, long gone to dust and bones. Another poem? Please. I like this one. It's very simple, but I like it. And it really is about, this is true love, This really happened, not to me necessarily, right? I cannot always tell which part of you I carry in me. Sometimes it's your voice or what lies behind your breathing. If tonight I dream your name, it is because I say it every day. Every day I call your name and call again until my mouth is full of you. Sometimes I cannot always say which part of you resides in me. I was in Jamaica, passing through Jamaica, which is a Caribbean island, and in many Caribbean islands, especially I would suggest in a few like Jamaica, the contrast between rich and poor is really shocking. A poor person is very, very, very poor. And rich people are very rich. I mean, they would have a swimming pool on the roof of the house to prove that they can do it. Yes? They would have a garage, on top of the house also to prove that they can do it. Because they just have a lot of money. And very poor people are extremely poor. I have found that quite distressing on many occasions. And in Caribbean literature, poetry, once spoken literature I spoke about, there's a kind of thing that we do with I call it poetry, where we get one very beautiful image, yeah, and the rest of the poem is a bit wobbly, as we say, but there's one image which just ties it together, and I tried it, even if it's in English. I heard this man one night just say, Jamaican, say, me hungry, me want food, I'm hungry, I want food, you know? And I couldn't sleep at night. I was in this hotel, and hearing this man crying for food. And I got up and I just wrote this, and so on. Tell me if you get the image, which I hope is beautiful. Poor man, poor old man, bathing in the lonely cold of night, lying magador in heat of hunger. Old man, poor old man, for eyes of whom the moon moves like a silver spoon, scooping up the rice of stars. If only you had the strength to sleep and a simple bowl of rice to eat. Did you get the pretty image? Which one is it? The moon, yes. The moon like a spoon scooping up the rice of stars. I mean, come on. I'm not usually self-congratulatory, but when I ask, yeah, it's very good. It's a very interesting thing because very often, and I hear people here speak like that sometimes, where, they will be saying something and suddenly a beautiful image pops up and it just summarizes everything. And you have lots of them. I can give you an example if you want. Right? You want to have another one and then we can change? I wrote them down because I tend to forget them. Okay, I'll do one, it's in my head. You've got to listen carefully, that's all. And it's based on, you know what rap is? You know what rap is? Rap music. Now let me tell you this, rap is a very, very old, it's not new, very, very old. People say it is of African origin, but in almost every African-based culture, you find a tradition in word usage like rap, where there's rhyme. In mine, it's there in African-American, which is very dominant now because of the African-American media. But rap is a very common thing. And I used to do rap long before rap became universal in the sense that I used to do poems using rap stuff. And in 1973, it's about an event in 74, where I was a child at the time, and there was a riot or a demonstration that became like a massacre basically because the police turned on so many of the young people and began to shoot them. And I saw that. And many people died, including my friends. It was really a terrible time in the history of my country. And I went home and I did it, and I never lost this poem. And it's interesting, I hope, with words and so on. Okay, it goes like this. 1974, guns, smoke white, rip sky, chair left, rock right, break center, make Grenada quake and shake like a child with ague. 1974, the fair creep deep, kill sleep, and all hearts cease to beat while we reaped seeds of hate and agony. And my grandmother shake her head in the wind. She says something is happening, and soon the time will come when no moon, no rain, no sun, no gun will stop the stomp of the people's feet or clamp down when it's dark, the fire bitter and the river flood of words pouring from my people's heart. And we lived 5 years before we see the truth of what she said to we. 1983. Guns, smoke white, rip sky, chair left, rock right, break, center. It happened again in 83, 1983. And that's it. Yeah? And again, it's using the rhythms that people speaking rather than using the rhythms of European poetry, I use the rhythms of mine. Yeah? Okay. I can stop here, can I? Okay. Any questions? Why are you so silent? Have I intimidated you? Have I said something to scare you? Yes? Because you're looking like this, and you're clearly very interested, but you're squirming. Are you too hot? No. Are you freaking out? Okay. I will read a piece of the writing, the one about the girl under the sea, yeah? You want to hear that? Okay, I read a piece for you. And the story is where it's like this girl, she came, and there's an old man who was a young man at the time she came. He's telling the story to a boy. And she came, you see, in a storm. She came in a special storm that we call an east storm, which is the worst storm you can have. Very terrible, it tears up the sea, it does terrible things, and so on. And he's telling this boy about this girl. And when the girl came, of course, he also was a very lonely man. He fell in love with her. It's a love story. And they had something really nice happening. But of course, people seeing this strange man, who they know, but they knew, with this strange girl, begin to wonder where she comes from, who is she? And gradually, eventually, well, you have to read the book to see what happens. But gradually, you know, it's really, I don't know how much it costs. Anyway, I'm not serious. Yes, gradually, terrible things begin to happen, or the people themselves begin to react to her terribly. Yes? So here's the old man talking about the girl, and I read it in a way that you will understand, using some of the Caribbean plus English fusion. There's no competition now with the shakes. She come on the curl of a wave, on top of it, like you were sitting on the edge of a moving, rolling cliff that lifts you up and rests you down right there on the ground in front of me. I didn't see her come. I figured that out by the way she just appeared. It had to be the only way. A girl, naked as the night and just as dark, standing there in front of me, trembling from the wet. She must have said something, asked for help, tell me hello, something I don't know. But I noticed the voice straight away, soft, like it had come from inside my head. She didn't speak like we speak, and I couldn't see her proper, except that she was slim and tall, and she was in a bad way, like she was going to fall down any minute. I didn't think about the confusion in my head, all the questions that began popping up straight away. Maybe she was one of those foreigners in a boat out there with other people, and the storm dragged that boat from under them. But how she managed to swim across that sea? Well, miracles does happen, not so. Don't think I didn't tell myself that I was mad or dreaming, that maybe my distress flew up in my head and made a woman out of air for me. But if it was distress, that I was distressed, I was happy to stay that way for the rest of my life. But you see, she had weight and voice and warmth. And when I carried her up the hill, the light from the sky fell on her face, and I saw that she was one of us. I fixed the bed on the floor for her. I did all this in the dark, with the lightning coming from the sky. And that night, I sat down on the floor and watched her for a while, wondering who she was, where she might have come from, and how anybody could come out of that kind of sea alive. I fell asleep on the floor with my head full of all those things. And it goes on and on. Yes? Okay. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you for thanking me.
Well, again, thanks to the British Council for introducing to us such great poets and writers from Britain and all the cultures that depicted. These Brits have their, let's say, culture spread all over the world, and it's reflected back on them and on us back then to go. Thanks to you for coming.
Thank you. Great.
We spoke today, right? You can tell again. Tuesday. Dina told me this morning about William Blake, and I persuaded him. He's giving everybody a hard time.
He's too British.
But I think it's your work, by the way.
Oh, that's good.
It's I don't know, I mean, Maiyo will tell more about it. I'm not,
We chose this from, from all over the world.
Indeed, well, I like this.
And we had really good candidates, but he was the best.
really? Anyway, what his work is of the Darat. He sent it to my name. That's really bad. I don't know what to do with it now.
The line?
But I don't know what to do. Because I think the hard time with the management. They have to put foreign ministry and what, and I don't know what, and this is the out, he has to pay for it. Securely, now I don't know what to do. Do you have experience with this?
Well, I will check the translation. I will let them help you. He's manager, director in the foundation. He did that. He has a long experience and he knows when the director